So, delight to be here. Thanks for the invitation. A little terrifying, I have to admit, especially since the original invitation was to talk for about 20 minutes, and then suddenly that sort of got blown out to talking for about an hour, which for academics should be no problem at all to talk for a 50-minute hour. What I've ended up with is picking up on a quote that I just happened to stumble across a couple of weeks ago by Martin Deutsch, grand old man in social psychology, who wrote, quote, "Social psychology has had a lot to say in general, but little to say in particular." And he could be describing my whole career, really. But particularly, I sort of take that to heart a little bit in what I plan to talk about. So I'm going to talk about some very general stuff, then resume writing close to a description of a vignette, of an awkward interracial interaction, and then zoom right back out to the general again. But before I do that, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands and the airways on which we meet. In my case, being in Canberra, that's the Normal people. And I'd like to pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to take the opportunity to acknowledge my great debts to my own academic elders, and many collaborators over the years, some of whose work will be visible here, but all of whom have been really influential over decades now in kind of challenging and questioning me and my thinking, and really shaping how I think about the world. Prime among them would be my old academic advisor, my PhD advisor at UC Santa Cruz, Tom Pettigrew. And I still feel a bit awkward talking about prejudice, still feeling somewhat in the shadow of him, who's obviously casts a very, very long shadow across all of social psychology's contributions to prejudice. And oddly, I know that he also feels that same awkwardness since his PhD advisor and mentor was Gordon Allport. Without really wanting to contradict Yolanda's introductory comments, I'm quite happy if people have questions. I know things are awkward. The interaction is awkward on Zoom, but as we go through, I'm very happy if people do want to either flag a question on the chat board or communicate some other way. And I'll do my best to deal with them as we go. Usually in these sorts of seminars, I much prefer it to be a kind of conversation rather than just me talking. That's obviously much harder in this medium, but quite happy to try if people would like to give it a go. So, all that preamble out of the way, start with some comments in general, going back to Deutsch's quote. One other preambling point. Much of what I'm going to talk about is still a big confusing mess in my head, and I'm still trying to work through what I think about a number of these issues, and for that reason really would value and appreciate questions and challenges as we go at the end, but also because of that I will have to apologize because I'm going to do what I tell all my students never to do, and that is to read some chunks, mostly because, as I say, I'm still thinking through this and it's not yet completely clear in my head. Some starting broad and general. So recent global movements, especially over the last month or so with Black Lives Matters, in slightly longer time frame with various climate change movements, and leading in next week to NAIDOC week. Remind me and remind us of the old Lavinian dictum about nothing so practical as a good theory. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. Should also certainly refreshes my commitment to social justice and refocuses our attention to the contributions that social psychology has and can and ought to make to social justice. I'm going to start with some broad comments about social psychology and justice in general, then zoom into some particular details about describing in detail a vignette, and then zoom back out to some general considerations and reflections. So, general, broad stuff. What is social justice? We all know it's a good thing and that we want more of it. Justice and its violations have always been potent in social life, getting what one deserves, being treated fairly, treating others with due concern and respect. Sizable challenges for all of us. They colour many, if not most, of our daily interactions. They affect our governments, unions, courts, the police, universities, health departments, hiring committees, promotions committees, and just about every single social institution function to maintain and, if you like, impose quote-unquote justice. Okay, I'm going to see if I can share a screen. Can people see that? Thank you. So a couple of quotes there from the noted famous philosopher John Rawls. Justice is the first virtue of social institutions, as truth is of systems of thought. And one may think of a public conception of justice as constituting the fundamental character of a well-ordered human association. And rereading those quotes this morning, that first one, I think ought to be challenged as truth is of systems of thought. I'm not sure that is self-evidently true anymore, unfortunately. That's just a parenthetical footnote as we go along. But Rawls goes on, people almost always disagree about the defining criteria of a just association, as evidenced by the fact that most societies are almost universally lacking the well-ordered nature he talks of. Which then raises the obvious and fundamental question, what is justice and what does social psychology have to do with it? We can agree, I think, that justice in all its forms is a value. People differ in which set of values they most strongly endorse. We can also agree, I think, there are many different types of justice. Social psychology, as I'm sure you'll know, distinguishes often between two primary types of justice, distributive and procedural justice. And there's less work, but still important, on restorative and retributive and other forms of justice. So if we talk about distributive justice, going back again to Morton Deutsch, these are justice principles that are used, heuristics that are used to allocate distribution of resources, usually scarce resources. So they can be distributed so that everybody receives outcomes proportional to inputs, the famous equity principle, as equals according to needs, abilities, and so on. There's an awful lot of them, and probably more since Deutsch compiled that list. preference for one or another of those distributive principles aligns with people's political ideology, varies also critically depending on what is being distributed. So a university tutor or lecturer giving grades at the end of a unit or a course, people distributing end-of-year bonuses or places in childcare centres or draft selections for football clubs or for having to do national service, they all function and operate differently. Importantly, they all also operate at the individual level. They depend on knowing an individual's level of need or their inputs or their abilities. Distributing resources according to any of those distributive principles might ensure some sort of distributive fairness or justice at the individual level, but it certainly does not necessarily ensure fairness or justice at a group level. If places in a highly competitive university course, for example, like medicine or clinical psychology, are offered to individual applicants solely on the basis of some individual quality, such as an ATAR score or a GPA, then arguably that's fair. But it might also mean that we end up with cohorts of students in those courses who are all white or all from relatively privileged family backgrounds or whatever. Following a principle that ensures individual fairness can obviously produce group unfairness. There's relatively little work on principles of group level distributive justice. I mentioned just one framework. It's worth noticing in passing. Is Phil Brickner's work on macro justice, what he calls macro justice principles, which are, he says, de-individuating, in that their operation does not require knowledge of individual attributes. Rather, macro justice principles specify a priori what the final pattern of allocated resources will look like. So common examples are things like teachers who grade on a normal curve, but other examples specify distribution minima and maxima, averages, ranges. Contemporary public debates about rising inequality often point to prescriptions such as that a CEO of a company should not be paid any more than, say, 5 or 10 times the average wage of all employees in the company. Implementations of affirmative action sometimes, or calls for quotas of MPs to be women and so on. They're all examples of macro justice principles. They specify a distribution of distributed outcomes without necessarily knowing anything at all about individual allocations. And of course, there's always tensions between micro justice and macro justice principles that play out. You can see it over the last decade or more in debates, public debates about water allocations from the Murray-Darling Basin. Questions about how much water can be drawn by whom and when. Do smallholder farmers have more entitlement than farms owned by large corporations or by international companies? Should water entitlements be able to be traded? Should farmers be able to build dams on their properties? What balance needs to be achieved between individual actions of farmers and others upstream, which might seem fair and reasonable, and the consequences for those downstream? And of course, different states have a stake in the Murray-Darling Basin, and state chauvinism just contaminates all that highly contested space. And so in that highly contested space, we see lots of tensions between micro-justice and macro-justice principles at play. And social psychology rightly ought to have something to contribute to that context. Brickman also argues that macro-justice considerations cannot usually be derived from the operation of micro-justice principles, and that this is kind of contentious, the operation of micro-justice principles inevitably conflicts with macro-justice concerns. A society that rigorously pursues a meritocracy where the goods and conditions of life are dispensed solely on merit, however that's defined, will inevitably become a society of inequality. There's a kind of social trap, kind of like Harden's tragedy of the commons. A society full of individuals, each maximizing their own outcomes, will inevitably not be one that maximizes the common good. However we define justice, it's clear that it's a slippery and complicated thing. It's also relative, as Marx's famous quote here illustrates. The operation of equity or other micro-justice principles might be based on individual qualities, but one can only know injustice is happening, and one can only feel injustice through social comparisons. And of course, how one responds to perceived injustices depends on a range of social processes, such as figuring out why the injustice is happening, who else is affected, and what, if anything, can be done about it. Whatever justice is, there's clearly not enough of it, because people, often in groups, complain about it. An important question to ask, I think, is then what, if anything, can social psychology contribute to enhancing social justice and ameliorating the personal and social costs of social injustices? I assume that we can never achieve social justice, per se, however we define that, just as we can never achieve sustainability. But we can usually recognize social injustice, even if we can't define it, and we can and should work toward it, not least because social injustice increases human misery. That doesn't seem to me to be at all an issue. What is at issue, sometimes fundamentally, is what social justice might look like, why are some people excluded from it, and what ought we as social psychologists here be doing to try to get more of it for more people. That sort of framework of thinking about these things inevitably then leads us to think about social change. Working towards social justice requires social change. What is it? What is social change? What is it that changes when we talk about social change? And I've never actually been able to answer that question satisfactorily. I've got here a quote from a former colleague of mine, the sociologist Cora Baldock. Social change may be defined as change in the structure of social relationships of sufficient magnitude to be clearly visible and of such nature as to be apparently irreversible. In other words, something changes, you can see it, and it isn't just something trivial that's changing. It reminds me of the old saying that you can never step into the same river twice. Rivers and society are always changing, but often the changes are more abstract and ephemeral than substantial and lasting. And that point is both profound and trivial. It's also true that change itself is a fundamental quality of what we consider defines something as a river. A river that does not change is not a river, but rather a lake or a puddle or something else other than a river. The same applies to individual humans. We constantly change too. Even our physical bodies constantly change. With our skin completely regenerating every 2 weeks and our bones every 10 years. The day that we stop changing is the day that we go in the ground. And of course, the same is true also for human societies. Like rivers, they do not stop changing ever, but just as we change our skins every fortnight, much social change is imperceptible and hence unimportant. Social change is something that many social psychologists care deeply about. And I'm sure you're all familiar with organizations like SPICY and sort of masthead quotes that SPICY draws upon from Kurt Levine, that research that produces nothing but books will not suffice. And there's nothing so practical as a good theory, which is a quote I want to come back to. Many psychologists, many social psychologists who draw upon that old Levinian quote, nothing so practical as a good theory, I've never read the full sentence from which it comes. And the full sentence completely, radically changes, for me anyway, the meaning, the context of that quote, semi-quote. The full quote is here. Many psychologists working today in an applied field are keenly aware of the need for close cooperation between theoretical and applied psychology. This can be accomplished if the theorist does not look toward applied problems with highbrow aversion or with a fear of social problems, and if the applied psychologist realizes that there's nothing so practical as a good theory. That famous quote is almost just the minor clause in the sentence. It's really addressed, I think, to what he calls theorists, those who get stuck in the laboratory and typically have a highbrow aversion or a fear of social problems. And I think we all need to take that to heart. So that's general context. Let's zoom right in now to the fine detail of a particular vignette. It describes an incident that clearly, I think, constitutes prejudice, but in an awkward sort of way. Prejudice is a pernicious, pervasive, and persistent social problem, especially for those who are the targets of prejudice. As a social phenomenon, it's always been pervasive and persistent, but its problematization is only recent. Not so long ago, and indeed in many ways still today, what we now call prejudice was and is seen as something natural and acceptable. Today, when something is labelled as prejudice, it's seen as opprobrious, but generally only by those who do the labelling. Those who are labelled as prejudice typically resist that label, often describing their beliefs or actions as natural, reasonable, and acceptable. I want to consider here now a particular example of prejudice in action. It was sent to me by a former colleague at Murdoch University, call him Tim. It describes an experience he had riding a public bus in Perth about a decade ago. He sent me the description via email, and I'm going to read through that email account that he sent to me with his permission, complete with all the chatty informality and grammatical infelicities of email. It may help to know that Tim, as a social psychologist, was once one of my students, now devotes much of his research energies to using social psychology to promote environmentally friendly behaviours. So this lasts a couple of pages, I'm afraid. Bear with me. So, quote, I just had a quite incredible intergroup relations experience just now on public transport on the bus on the way back from Mount Lawley from a meeting in the city at the DEC, Department of Environment Conservation. A group of Indigenous folk got on the bus at that park on Beaufort Street, just out of the city, to head to Morley Shopping Centre. That particular park is a common place for Indigenous people to hang out. There are apparently numerous reasons for this, other than the usual racist interpretations of they're just a load of drunken layabouts, but that's another issue or story. Anyway, one of the dudes was pretty drunk and was making a bit of a nuisance of himself, with the bus driver threatening to throw him off the bus if he didn't sit or quieten down, etc., etc. Eventually, one of the other passengers, bracket, a rather portly middle-aged white woman who had her grandson with her in a pram, close quote, started arcing up and announcing that, quote, you're upsetting my grandson. He's not used to people swearing and carrying on. Have some consideration for other people who have also paid a fare. And eventually announced that we don't have to put up with this. I'm getting off this bus and catching another one. She then started inviting everyone else to join her, which they didn't, saying that, come on, I think all the civilized people should get off the bus. As she passed the driver, she yelled to him that You should do something about this. Call security, get them thrown off. Once she was safely out of the bus on the footpath, she then really let loose, yelling, "You blackfellas think you own this whole damn country, but you don't." And as the bus drove off, she stood there fuming, shaking her head with her hands on her hips. Ironically enough, I actually had my $750 16-bit stereo digital recorder with me, as I'd been testing at the DEC for the focus group next week. And as this all began to unfold, I hit record, but alas, the damn bus was so noisy that it didn't work. Anyway, it was one of those moments where you were watching a total disaster of intergroup relations unfold in front of you. I think when experience or watch events like that, it really rams home how infinitely complex racism, in quotes, is as a thing. There's absolutely no way that that grandmother would admit for a second that her reaction was anyway racist. And I couldn't help wondering, in a reflexive sort of way, what the non-racist reaction to the whole set of events would or should be. Is it to do as I and most other passengers did, sit there and try to pretend it wasn't really happening? What of the bus driver? What is he supposed to do? To be honest, I really felt for him because his institutionalized role demanded that he take some sort of action, really, but assuming he wasn't actually a bigot, it must be hard in a situation like that where your role dictates that you should act, but to do so in any way opens you up to being seen as potentially racist in the eyes of all the people on the bus who didn't share their portly grandmother's viewpoints. I think what it perhaps really rammed home for me, yet again, is the importance of the situation. And from my point of view anyway, the importance of identifying what has actually given rise to that situation. Problem is not, as the portly grandmother seems to think it was, that the blackfellas think they own this country. Problem is perhaps something more related to the fact that these particular blackfellas actually don't feel like, or indeed actually own any little bit of this country, giving rise to a situation that sees them hanging out in a park drinking alcohol. But perhaps the most interesting part about the little piece of micro-interaction on the bus was the complexity of the ways in which norms were potentially at play. For example, such things as what is normative bus capturing conduct? What norms of conduct exist relating to how one should respond to disorderly conduct on a bus, both for drivers and passengers? What happens when you overlay an Indigenous, non-Indigenous dynamic over the top of that? Were the other passengers reading the norms off the response of others, i.e. descriptive norms? And how should we as social psychologists theorize the grandmother's response? I mean, one reading of it could be that she was trying to mobilize minority influence along Moscovici. I suspect that was probably what she felt like she was doing, that is, overcoming the two-pronged oppression of both the blackfellas and the political correctness of the other passengers, as she probably saw it. Her anger, for example, seemed to be as much at the driver, and to a lesser extent the other passengers, for not acting, as it is at the blackfellas. So should we read this as a Kitty Genovese, a little Latin darling? Perhaps these other non-Indigenous folk on the bus were just engaging in bystander apathy, were they? Or were they perhaps more likely sitting there not knowing what to do because it seemed like to do anything could be potentially readable as racist? I think that it's moments like this that really get at what prejudice is all about. It's not about the grandmother being racist per se, it's about a system of structural inequity that gives rise to situations in which all players, including the drunk Indigenous dude, at best probably find it pretty difficult to know how on earth to deal with it and do nothing. And that worse, and deal with it very badly. Allow the portly grandmother and arguably perhaps the drunk Indigenous bloke too. I suspect that the difference between response number 1 and response number 2 on behalf of the powerful majority actors is probably a lot to do with how they read the cause of the situation in which they and the other actors find themselves. It is very easy for people like the grandmother to read the situation in terms of, this is so unfair, why should myself and my grandson be subject to this? Without for a second thinking, well, it's also pretty unfair that white people came onto this land 200 years ago and have systematically dismantled all the semblance of the structure of Indigenous life and culture that had been here for thousands of years prior. Furthermore, I'm pretty sure that the grandmother wouldn't for a second consider the fact that she can simply step off that bus and immediately extricate herself from this supposedly unfair and oppressive situation in which she found herself, whereas the young Indigenous dude has most likely got to, if you'll excuse rather wanky metaphor, ride his bus of racial oppression to the end of the line. I also think that this story says something interesting about public transport too. I think it simultaneously highlights why lots of people don't like public transport and why people getting out of their cars and onto public transport is actually so important. The reason I suggest the latter is that I think one of the most socially powerful aspects of people moving toward catching public transport is it encourages them to remember that not everyone in the world is like them and their friends. Of course, this is probably not necessarily good enough because it has the potential to simply confirm prejudices among empowered majorities of various kinds, while potentially fueling resentment in a relative deprivation sense among disempowered minorities. That's the end of Tim's email. It's a long, long story, and thank you for your patience as I read through it. You can tell, obviously, he's a social psychologist and the way he thinks about things. But for me, it's a really, Tim's description of that little vignette on a bus captures so much of what is problematic and complex and difficult about prejudice as a topic for us to understand and potentially do something about to reduce actual and perceived injustice. So what can we learn about prejudice from that example? One way I think about what we can learn is by thinking about, trying to imagine what each of the actors in the vignette would say when they got home and were sitting around the dinner table that night with their family. What might you imagine the quote-unquote drunk dude would say? Would he say he'd acted obnoxiously in public transport, insulted people, swore, offended an elderly woman and her grandson? What were the drunk dude's mates make of this vignette? How would they portray their own actions and justify their own actions? And what do we make of the fact that they're largely silent in that story? Especially, what would the portly grandma say when she got home? When she described her day, including picking up the grandson, going out for a nice pleasant day, catching the bus. There was a bit of kerfuffle, and she kind of vented the sort of racist fury. She wouldn't for a minute say that at all. She would have an interpretation that justified her actions and railed against, presumably, all the ills of the world that were captured in that kind of steel box on wheels. What about the bus driver or the grandson in the pram? Tim doesn't say how old the grandson is, but presumably old enough that he may potentially be offended. The grandmother would think he is potentially offended by the sort of language he was hearing. But what is he learning about a social grammar? What is he learning about the dynamics of intergroup relations right in front of his eyes? I'm just going to sidestep a little bit. That reminds me many, many years ago of another vignette from when my eldest son was then maybe 5, and he and his brother and I were living in a duplex in suburban Perth. To that point in his life, Alex, my eldest, had spent most of his life in California, and he and his younger brother used to hang out with the kid around the corner, just mucking about. And one day, Alex and his brother came home and said to me, "I don't want to play anymore with David," I'll call him, the kid around the corner. And I said, "Why not?" "Because he's Aboriginal," he said. which of course made my jaw drop for many, many reasons. And we had kind of nice, educative father-son interaction. The thing that intrigued me most and that is relevant here is that Alex, then aged 5, was able to say he did not want to play with another kid because he's Aboriginal. That other kid, David, was not Aboriginal at all. He was Chinese Singaporean. So Alex had managed to acquire enough of an understanding of the rules of social interaction and what are the major groups in Australian society. They had formed those mental categories. He had also somehow from somewhere attached valence to those things, to those categories, but he did not yet have the cognitive sophistication to be able to identify the content of those empty mental categories. They're empty, but they're valenced. One can imagine the grandson sitting in the pram on the bus, filling in all these empty mental categories as he learns through socialization what it is to be like in Australian culture. What about the other passengers on the bus? What did they make? Is Tim's analysis right about their inaction, the fact that they just didn't say or do anything in this interaction? And of course, how we understand their actions is complicated by the fact that it's not a pure, distilled, isolated interracial interaction. The footnote always put shutter quotes around race. There are all sorts of other non-race related norms at play here. Those of you who ride public transport know, at least in this country, there are very strong norms about limiting interpersonal interactions at all. You just don't talk to people, you don't look at people, you just exist in your own self-contained bubble. So to the extent that this whole interaction happened within a very clearly defined setting, it's within a bus, it's literally within a box. There are strong norms governing all behavior that happens there, and then this interracial interaction happened within that broader normative bubble. And finally, what sense do we make of Tim's actions here? And that's a point that I really want to bring home here. So Tim is acting as a well-trained social psychologist. He turned on his very expensive 16-bit digital recorder. Unfortunately, it didn't work. He himself did not engage in the interaction. He sat as a passive observer, trying to understand it, trying to record it. So collect the data, analyze it, interpret it, but do not intervene, do not intercede. Many years ago, my friend and colleague Martha Augustinus and I published our first edition of a book called Social Cognition. The second edition, I don't think we used this cartoon in the first, but in the second edition, with another friend and colleague, Mary Donahue, we made good use of this cartoon by Lunig, of a single solitary figure peering through the understandoscope at the teeming mass below. And it's also very hard, this cartoon was penned pre-2001, but if you look in the distance, the background of the cartoon, it is very hard not to see that plane that's just about to hit a tall tower. The character does look like a guy, looking through the understandoscope, trying to understand humanity below, really encapsulates social psychologists typically, and psychologists generally, and Tim in this interaction. The person peering through the understandoscope is simultaneously both a member of what he is trying to understand and trying to abstract himself, to pull off the so-called God trick of being separate from what it is that's being understood or to be understood. maybe you can pull off that trick as God, but I don't think humans can, and we ought not. Certainly as social psychologists concerned about social justice and social change, we ought not to abstract ourselves that way. Back to the vignette. How far do we get in understanding that vignette by using the normal theoretical frameworks of social psychology? Can we see evidence there of, for example, the operation of implicit bias? That's kind of all the rage these days. Of automatic or controlled stereotype activation and so on. To be frank, I don't see much evidence of that, at least in Tim's retelling of the vignette. Is there evidence of personality-based explanations of prejudice? Is the portly grandmother likely a highly authoritarian, or does she have a particularly strong social dominance orientation? It's impossible to say, but unlikely, I think. Is there strong evidence of normative compliance? There probably is, and Tim's analysis certainly relies on that framework. But what norms? So it's not just interracial norms. There's a lot of other norms about how one behaves on a bus, and that affects the driver as well as other passengers. Evidence of the processes that social identity theory articulates. Again, like normative compliance, almost certainly yes, but does it provide a full account? Not convinced. Intergroup contact theory goes some way, but again, not a full account. I think each of those different perspectives may offer, does offer insights of more or less use, but to me at least, none seems to capture the whole episode. So obviously the question then is, what is missing? What is left to be explained and understood? First, the vignette describes an interaction within a social space. And so it's bounded, in this case, literally by the bus. But some of the work by people like Durham and Dixon, looking at bounded interactions within social spaces, for example, on beaches or on public spaces on South African university campuses, kind of addresses this. I think it's fairly obvious also that each actor and bystander in the vignette has their own view of and interpretation of what is happening and why, and that those views do not necessarily align at all. Then it's important also to consider, I think, what is it we have to change to allow the vignette to play out differently? Change here is difficult, I think. In other words, what role could we as an individual social psychologist, such as Tim in the interaction, or more generally as social psychologists, trying to change the nature of intergroup interactions? What do we have to change to allow that vignette to play out differently? And change here is difficult, I think, because even though it's a very small microcosm of an interaction, there are still very many moving parts. And whenever one tries to change anything in that sort of system, the change attempt is resisted. And in fact, I think this social space defines a system that is resilient. And so I find it useful, valuable to think of it systemically. And that then takes me back to Levine. I'm not quite sure how we're doing for time. Maybe another 10 minutes. But before doing that, systems by their nature and their operation are resilient. They resist change. They tend to be self-organizing, self-perpetuating, so that any attempt to change a system typically has to encounter or overcome the forces of resistance against that change. And it's not easy. obviously social psychology has got decades worth of attempts to produce change with some success, but it's very difficult to produce change in this context that is durable and persistent and generalizable. Fairly easy to generate short-term quick change, but longer lasting change I think is difficult, partly because the behavior of all the people in that vignette, as always, is produced systemically. So implications and reflections on all of that for our understanding of prejudice and perhaps more broadly social change and social justice. The first is that for me, that vignette challenges the typical definitions of what prejudice is that social psychology relies upon. So most definitions, as you know, stem from Allport's classic definition, quote, ethnic prejudice is an antipathy based upon a faulty and inflexible generalization. It may be felt or expressed, may be directed toward a group as a whole or toward an individual because he is a group member or is a member of that group. Most definitions still have some form of that. An important writer in Allport's classic 54 book, an important writer to that definition, often forgotten, is that, quote, the net effect of prejudice thus defined is to place the object of prejudice at some disadvantage not merited by his own conduct. It produces injustice. There are all sorts of problems with Allport's definition. Rupert Brown has objected, given a number of reasons to object to it. He sees, for example, no value in labeling prejudice as faulty or irrational or false, because doing so implies that we can identify a set of true or accurate representations of a group and its members, and that's enormously problematic. A second major issue for Rupert is that the standard definitions typically also make assumptions about the etiology of prejudice, and that probably is not warranted or useful. He defines prejudice, Rupert defines prejudice as the holding of derogatory social attitudes or cognitive beliefs, expression of negative affect, or the display of hostile or discriminatory behavior toward members of a group on account of their membership in that group. And that's, I think, fair and reasonable, but maybe doesn't go quite far enough. And the reason I think it doesn't go quite far enough is that rejoinder, or the rider in Allport's original definition about leading to injustice or disadvantage. So if you accept that qualification in Allport's view, then without any definition that does not allow for that effect, then there is no prejudice. A different way of thinking about prejudice and defining it then, I think, is to define it as an action, not as an attitude or a value or an affect. Prejudice is an action injurious to another or others in which the rights of the other or others are ignored or diminished because of their putative social category membership. Defining it as an action gets around some of the definitional problems about etiology, about holding views that do not lead to injury or diminution of rights of others. And it also, I think, gets around the problem inherent in almost every definition of prejudice in social psychology, and that is that those definitions necessarily locate prejudice within the individual. And to tell an audience of social identity people what the major severe problems in defining prejudice that way. Defining it as an action gets around that problem because action is always jointly produced in context. So therefore we don't end up reducing anything to just the individual. Prejudice is thus not individualized, but rather located in the social interaction, set of social interactions and social relations that we all occupy. The second implication or reflection is that there are obviously many prejudices. That particular vignette described by Tim focuses on one, but it's important also, I think, to recognize that there are potentially others in that vignette, others at play in that vignette, including gender-based stereotypes and age-based stereotypes. And it's almost certainly the case, I think, that racism is not the same as sexism, neither is the same as ageism or fatism or classism or anti-Semitism or any sort of thisism or thatism. Prejudice is a complex, multifaceted thing. In fact, it is a complex in the technical definition of complex. And that the form and dynamics of a prejudice will always vary depending on the group that is the target of the prejudice. Different groups always have different history, different socioeconomic positions, different relationships with the majority group, different relationships among themselves, which all mean that thisism is never the same as thatism. Fourth point for me is that prejudice arises, again, this is obvious to a social identity, obvious, arises from social and intergroup dynamics. It is typically traditional definitions of prejudice in social psychology see prejudice as residing within the individual. Individuals engage in prejudice. But it should be obvious, I think, that individuals do not do that in a social vacuum. Prejudice always happens in a social context, narrowly defined in this, or operationalized in the example of the vignette, but always in a broader social context. Prejudice is about groups. It's about differential treatment of people according to group membership. The nature of the relationships between groups shapes and informs and drives if and when and where and how prejudice manifests in the behaviors of individuals. Furthermore, patterns of intergroup dynamics delimit if and when and where and how members of groups are able to interact with one another more generally. In Australia, for example, it is not uncommon for Anglo-Australians, dislike that term a lot and find it unuseful, but I found a better term. It's not uncommon for Anglo-Australians never to interact with an Aboriginal person because their social orbits never interact with those of Aboriginal people. Patterns of segregation in housing, education, and employment and so on mean that many Anglo-Australians never have the opportunity to interact with Aboriginal people. Their environment does not afford them that possibility. Of course, that does not prevent them from forming beliefs and attitudes, stereotypes and prejudices about Aboriginal people. But those beliefs and attitudes can remain cocoons, safely never challenged by the rigors of intergroup reality. Prejudices, both positive and negative, can therefore remain and persist unchallenged. Prejudice is acquired through social transmission. The example of my eldest son many years ago is a clear example of acquiring prejudices through cultural transmission. There's obviously no direct, I hope it's obvious, no direct instruction for him to think or feel that way. He's acquired it somehow, somewhere. Social and intergroup dynamics exist outside of the individual. They have a material reality that does not depend on individuals. Individuals are born into a social matrix containing a complex set of intergroup relations and dynamics, and we all must acquire knowledge of those in order to be a functioning member of society, but we do it implicitly without direct instruction. But there must be, therefore, mechanisms and processes to ensure the socialization of individuals into that knowledge. almost certainly doesn't happen explicitly. Just as people learn their native language without explicit instruction, I think learning that language happens almost osmotically, and people acquire huge vocabulary, rules of syntax, know how to generate sentences and complex utterances and so on. But it all happens without effort on the part of the person learning or those around. And in the same sort of way, I think people acquire a kind of social grammar about the nature of intergroup relations and dynamics in their society. Without instruction, people learn what are the primary groups in community and culture, what characteristics are associated with those groups, what the hierarchy is, which are seen as desirable, which are to be avoided. Learning all of that obviously is a highly complex process. And I don't think we understand it terribly well at all. And of course, it's not to say that the effects are unavoidable. The effects of learning all that knowledge are unavoidable. Not everyone ends up accepting the images of groups or the ordering of groups, the valence of groups that these social processes dictate to us. In fact, many people, many in the audience today, actively resist those things, but everyone certainly knows them. Prejudice is a verb, I should say, not as a verb, as a verb. So I'd probably argue that prejudice does not exist as such. It's not a thing. It's a construct that we invent to describe and explain a wide range of behaviours and experiences. It's an efficient concept that way, but it's not the only way to describe those behaviours and experiences, maybe not even the most efficient way. But despite the fact that prejudice does not exist as such, the word prejudice exists, of course, and in English at least that word is a noun. Stereotypes and discrimination are related constructs. Both are nouns, but both also have commonly used verb forms, stereotyping and discriminating. Although the noun prejudice does have a verb form, for example, we sometimes say that lack of sleep prejudiced my chances of doing well on an exam, so as a verb form. The verb form is rarely used. Nouns and verbs, adjectives and adverbs connote different psychological understandings subtly. That's curious, I think, and in some ways telling, that English does not have or use a verb form of prejudice in the same way it refers to stereotyping and discriminating. And one psychological implication of that is that prejudice does not seem to be something that is actively done or performed by individual actors. In the vignette, the portly grandmother, but implicitly all the actors on that bus. The agency and hence the responsibility of individual actors is thereby diminished. Finally, here, prejudice is functional. Prejudice happens, it's pervasive, it's resistant to change. It must be then, I think, that it is functional. If prejudice were dysfunctional, it would be infrequent and it would diminish to some sort of random baseline of occurrence. Prejudice must be in some ways functional for some people. Who benefits from prejudice and in what ways is often not considered by us in social psychology. But if we ignore questions about the functions and benefits of prejudice, I don't think we can hope to tackle it successfully.